The role of Islam as a political power, but also a militant power, also took root in Afghanistan, as the Soviets occupied Afghanistan and the Saudis, which had faced their own zealots inside their country, laid siege to the mosque in Mecca and were starting to worry about the grand designs of Khomeini, who had ambitions beyond Iran and beyond the Shia community. The Saudis saw an opportunity to lead the Muslim world in opposition to Iran by feeding and helping the fight against the Soviets in Afghanistan. Of course, the unintended consequences of what was then a good war are known to all, leading up to the withdrawal of the Americans today from Afghanistan. And so in that 1 year, you had the birth of political Islam as a potent power that could bring a theocracy to power. And you had the power of the gun that young hothead Muslims, zealots, but also bored and unemployed, suddenly discovered on the battlefield of Afghanistan.
I want you to describe for us Beirut was known as the Paris of the East. And I grew up in the 70s. We knew of the non-aligned movement and how Gamal Abdal Nasser of Egypt, the president of Egypt, and our own Prime Minister Jawaharlal Nehru, along with Yugoslav President Tito, sort of initiated the non-aligned movement. Everything was anti-colonial. People were moving in a progressive direction. And then, something happened. So describe for us your time growing up, how the cafe culture, people were debating leftist ideas, etc.
So I have to just warn our viewers that things have been a little bit heated in Beirut this week. There have been some violent clashes. And unfortunately, I am hearing some shooting again. So I just want to warn you not to be alarmed. If you do hear shooting, it's far away, but I can hear it. And if it gets really bad, I might have to move away from the windows. But so far, so good. I did grow up in the civil war here, so I can continue doing my business as usual, even while things are blowing off. But not to bring too much of today's tensions, which are not necessarily connected to this discussion, or are to some extent connected to the discussion, but let's stay in the history for a moment, which is the core of our subject. You refer to the non-aligned movement, Gamal Abdal Nasser. It was an era in the region, in the world, of the left, of liberation movements, of anti-colonial and anti-imperial politics. And across the region, that's what defined the politics. But there was, of course, also the pro-American camp and the capitalism, market economy, and so on. And those were discussions that were taking place across this region. And at the time, unlike today, the idea of political Islam or militant Islam was not something that featured in the conversation because it was not yet part of what was available to people. What changed that were a series of events that led to 1979. Of course, Gamal Abdel Nasser lost in his war against Israel, and there was some reckoning there. Was it because people weren't praying enough? Was it because they were not religious enough? So there was some sense there of why had God let down the Arabs in their battle against Israel? It was, of course, the Palestinian cause that was at the heart of a lot of the discussions around the region. But in Iran, you had the Shah, who was in hindsight, perhaps one could describe him as a benign despot, certainly in comparison with what the Iranians are having to deal with today. But he was a pro-American despot, and there was a sense that there was an injustice there. And his white revolution to modernize the country was simply going too far, too fast for a lot of people. And there was a desire amongst many to remove him from power. And revolutionaries, Iranian revolutionaries, were preparing in Lebanon, for many of them, were preparing in Lebanon with Palestinian guerrilla fighters. That's one slightly underreported part of this region's history, which forms the first chapter of my book. They were training with Palestinian guerrillas in Lebanon, where the civil war was already raging, to find ways to topple the Shah in Iran. Amongst those revolutionaries were not just leftist nationalists, but also Islamists. And at the end of the day, a revolution against the Shah, which had started as a mostly leftist nationalist movement, was hijacked by the Islamist elements at the heart of it, namely by Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini, and it was transformed into an Islamic revolution, and that's how Iran became an Islamic republic. And for those who were fighting against or pushing against their oppressors, whether it was President Anwar Sadat in Egypt or others in the region, they saw that example of how Islam could actually be successful and a theocracy could topple a despot. And it gave a lot of ideas to a lot of people, from Egypt all the way to Pakistan. And the role of Islam as a powerful tool was born in that year. And of course, Khomeini tried to export his revolution as well. And that leads us to the birth of a group like Hezbollah in Lebanon, which was at the heart of the clashes in Beirut this week. The role of Islam as a political power, but also a militant power, also took root in Afghanistan, as the Soviets occupied Afghanistan, and the Saudis, which had faced their own zealots inside their country, laid siege to the mosque in Mecca, and were starting to worry about the grand designs of Khomeini, who had ambitions beyond Iran and beyond the Shia community. The Saudis saw an opportunity to lead the Muslim world in opposition to Iran by feeding and helping the fight against the Soviets in Afghanistan. Of course, the unintended consequences of what was then a good war are known to all, leading up to the withdrawal of the Americans today from Afghanistan. And so in that 1 year, you had the birth of political Islam as a potent power that could bring a theocracy to power. And you had the power of the gun that young, hothead Muslims, zealots, but also bored and unemployed, suddenly discovered on the battlefield of Afghanistan.
If you've enjoyed the conversation that you just heard, do subscribe to our channel for much more.